NIHR has very high expectations for PPI, and some applicants do it very well, some applicants do it very poorly. And our panel has 2 expert PPI members who review every single application. They'll be involved in your interviews, and they don't influence the scoring of fellowship applications by and large, but they have the ability to put conditions that could prevent you receiving the award unless you comply. So take your PPI very seriously and think how you can work PPI into your application. Now, how did your PPI consultation shape your application? How will PPI members be involved? How will they continue to influence your projects? What will you do to take on board observations made by your PPI people in delivery of your research? So it's just something that NIHR takes very, very seriously and is actually doing quite well. So just to summarize it so that we can stop and get on with the questions, the overall sort of package for a fellowship application is you as a person, the place that's supporting you, the project and your training plan. It really helps if you can articulate your own brand, your own unique selling point, and be able to summarize that in as few words as possible, 25, 30 words. Be able to summarize your 5-year goals. What are NIHR getting when they fund you? You need to be able to demonstrate that you're in the best place for your training and your fellowship with the best people and the best support. And by virtue of the fact you're going down the fellowship route, you're in it for the long haul. So be prepared to think 10 years in the future, 15, 20 years in the future. As an early career researcher, it's very difficult to do that. And I mentioned it in the slide earlier on. That's fine, because you can try and articulate your long-term plans and then be prepared to revise those plans as life actually unfolds, but be able to articulate what you aim to do at the beginning. And then finally, in the clinical schemes, the clinical academic and HEI and NHS integration is really important. So make sure you're in a place where you can demonstrate that integration. And some places are more mature and the relationships are more mature than others. LTHT and University of Leeds have that quite well developed, but you won't necessarily find that with every department. And if you partner with other institutions, you might not find it with other institutions. So just be aware that that intense integration is fundamental. So I'm going to stop. Carol asked me to just flag with you with this slide. Carol, do you want to jump in and say anything?
Just want to advertise our next event, which happens to be next Tuesday, which is at 7 o'clock next Tuesday. And again, it's on the same pathway of what we're talking about today, is about preparing for your fellowship. And we've got a panel next week, a mixed panel of medics and non-medics who have been through the process and want to ask questions of this panel about things that they wish they knew before they wrote their application. So I would highly recommend joining us same time, same place next week.
Super. So I will stop sharing my screen. And my thinking was, if we have questions that come from the floor that relate to any of those slides, I can go back to the slides, or we can just answer the questions as a set of talking heads.
So I'll start off with the chat questions. We've got a couple of questions in the chat at the moment. We can't see Anne-Maree and we can't see John, so that might be quite nice for people to see the other panel members. So my first question is from Nasir. It says, for the advanced fellowship, how does the NIHR view health economic analysis of secondary data? Anne-Maree, you're muted as well. Thank you.
It kind of depends. So for an advanced fellowship, you're looking at kind of something that's going to be perhaps like a program of work, which is interrelated. And so there are 2 levels of advanced fellowship. There are an early postdoc offer and a more established postdoc, and you get to nominate which you go into. It's self-nomination. And the reason that's really important, because you will be up against other people, and so the late advanced fellowships, you're looking at people who are on their track to being, to their chairs, and that they tend to be very established people. So it's really important that you get that pitch right. So just doing secondary data analysis really kind of doesn't sound terribly ambitious unless it's linked into other areas. And so as a component of a number of different things that's kind of more of an umbrella. I think it's very important. One of the things that NIHR value very clearly is kind of this whole push around, interrogating data and interrogating data kind of intelligent outcomes, and not just around artificial intelligence, but it's also around kind of more ambitious, well, not ambitious, artificial intelligence is very ambitious, but more, I guess, applied areas. So just having secondary data analysis, I think, would be limited, but it would be around kind of widening that out. And Nazir, if you've got specific questions, I'm happy to answer those. But I guess it's really important, as Tony was saying, around pitching that level, that, doing a secondary data analysis as part of a PhD might be okay, but as part of an advanced fellowship, where you're looking at being kind of on that trajectory to being a research leader, would need to be part of I think a wider question.
And if I could just jump in and say, I think we do see applications that are looking to, you're looking for some novelty. So where people are combining databases and things like that provides a bit of extra interest, which wouldn't necessarily accrue from just reworking an existing data set. But essentially, again, we're talking about fellowships being a training vehicle. So if you're able to propose an analysis of a secondary analysis of an existing data set that significantly develops your skills in a specific area, and that's the best vehicle for doing it, then that's absolutely fine.
Carol, do you want me to ask?
Thank you very much.
Carol's question too?
Yeah, go for it.
Daniel's asking is on the IAT pathway, which is, for those who don't know the terminology, it's the Integrated Academic Training Fellowship. So it's absolutely kind of this pathway for medics. And so the idea is that when you do a doctoral fellowship on that pathway, because you're still in training, they are very committed for you to continue to train and develop your and not to lose your clinical skills. And therefore it's one of the really fabulous kind of options, and and the MRC do the same thing. So NIHR aren't the only funding body in town, and even Wellcome also do that. But they see that the importance of kind of developing that research career alongside your clinical training career. So the kind of guidance is for a full-time doctoral fellowship that you do a day a week of clinical training. That clinical training doesn't have to be directly related to your research question, but obviously it's going to be likely to be related to it, but it really needs to be undertaken in consideration to, your clinical development. So, for example, we have some real barriers and some issues that we have to deal with when we're talking about, say, orthopaedic surgeons or anaesthetists, what they loosely call the craft profession, which I find kind of an odd term, that basically they can't just not do their clinical work, because that's kind of, it's around the skill acquisition, and so it kind of needs to be developed, in terms of where you are and what you need to get out of it. And it's a really important part, but it's one of the fantastic parts of these types of the doctoral fellowships, and also the ICA clinical doctoral fellowships, that you do get to do training development alongside your academic development.
And some medics do come out of program. That's a very common model. You have 3 years out of program and get on with it and suspend your training. But it's also a very common model to get an academic training number and to combine your ongoing specialist clinical development with a PhD, which lasts, and then the whole process lasts slightly longer. So both models are available.
We've got a question from Claire. Sorry, Claire. Thanks for the great presentation. And it's talking about the advanced fellowship, which is the early stage. Would it be a problem if someone of previous short research projects that have not resulted in publications? I'm guessing that the advanced fellowship, we would have expected publications at that stage after completing a PhD. I don't know who would like to take that question up.
I'll take that. So yeah, I mean, one of the things we really do look for is continuity. We are looking to see that somebody, I used the term earlier on, is a completer. So we want to see that if you've been funded for a piece of work or you've done a piece of work previously, you've published. But we're also looking for commitment. We would, again, most panelists are fairly experienced at doing this. You want evidence that somebody is actually going in a direction. You don't want people to be chasing the next shiny thing and going in different directions from one fellowship or one stage of their career to another. So I think the simple answer is, if you do have 2 from your PhD, you emphasise that they come from your PhD, and then in an application you link to how what you're proposing is an extension of that. And again, you can be creative in that, because the extension might simply be using some transferable skills in a slightly different space. It doesn't necessarily have to be just the next step in what you would do as a clinician, as your sort of clinical skills become more enhanced.
I guess that's a question I get asked quite a lot. Like, what is the minimum number of publications? What is the minimum grant, income I need to have? And when I talk to people, I say there isn't really an answer to that. But as a panel member, Tony, what do you look at?
It depends on the level. So obviously it depends on the level. That's a given. So if you're a PCAF, you're currently not holding an academic award at all, and you're thinking about getting into it, then a PCAF, there'd be no expectations at all. For a doctoral fellowship, it's great if you've got some publications. Well, you'd need to have some publications just to show you've been inquisitive in an area before you start on a CRF. You're disadvantaged by having none. And then obviously, as you become more advanced, the expectations become higher. You'd expect grants to kick in probably at sort of first postdoc fellowship level. Wouldn't expect you to have grants at PhD student, CDRF, DRF level. But the absolute fundamental thing that we're looking for is that your CV is, to use an only fools and horses type term, is straight. So the first thing I will do as an application reviewer is I'll go through the publication list particularly, and I'll do a mental filter on what's genuine and what's fluff. And if you're, say you're going for a first foundation or advanced fellowship, but at the lower level, and you've got in your CV that you have maybe, I don't know, 12 publications, and I go through and filter them, and particularly for clinicians, I find that 4 of them are opinion pieces in professional type journals rather than something substantive, and 2 others, you're a middle author where you clearly haven't led on the research. My mental calculation is straight away, okay, so you're telling me you have 12 publications, but actually you only have 6, and that's something that I think all experienced panelists will do. So there's no hard figure, because it varies according to specialty and according to level, but there are some things that you can do which you will get caught out by.
That's great. And we've got a question now from Angel, who I happened to be speaking to earlier on today. And I think I'm going to direct this to John, if that's okay, because I know that John's on the PCAF panel. John, about developing publication history, and how does that work with actually applying for your PCAF? Can you incorporate that within your training plan? Do you need to have some kind of structure before you apply for your PCAF?
Sorry, was the question about having publications already?
How do you intertwine writing your publications? So then people might not have publications at the moment and are thinking of applying for a PCAF, but have things that they potentially could write up in that PCAF time. How do you explain that? How do you get that incorporated into your PCAF application?
I would say you could put it either in the section where you describe your career and research aspirations, or you could also put it in your training and development. You could apply for funding to do that. If you link it up with your supervisory team, so if your supervisory team are going to help you do that, I think that would be really good to get that across as well. So I don't think there's any hard and fast rule as to where it should be, but I think if you're showing that it's part of the process, that it's part of your the development. It's part of the PCAF, which is obviously what the PCAF is about. It's, you know, giving you some funding and some time to develop your basic skills. So yes, I would say it doesn't, probably training and development actually would be the best place to put it, and kind of build it into your story.
Yeah, Anne-Maree's got her hand up. I think she wants to add something to that.
Yeah, just to add that the PCAF is absolutely what it says on the title. It's a pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship. Publications and preparing publications are part of that, and that you know, if you can justify some time for you to publish something that you've already done, that makes so much sense. But it needs to be part of this absolute trajectory towards putting in a competitive doctoral application. And that's the same if we have any GPs on the line for the in fellowship training fellowship as well.
Because I guess that's the hardest step, isn't it? Getting onto the ladder, getting onto the research ladder. Once you're on the ladder, you've got something to write about. You've got something that you can show your value on. So are there any other top tips for people that are considering applying for a PCAF fellowship that are currently in clinical roles at the moment and are trying to make their way?
There are, I would say, bear in mind that obviously there are two streams to the PCAF. There's a PCAF and the PCAF bridge, and in the PCAF bridge is aimed at people who have slightly more experience. So it goes back to what Tony was saying in his presentation. You know your level and know exactly what stream you want to apply for. The standard PCAF gives you more time and more money, and the PCAF bridge is aimed at people who are slightly more experienced, but they're not quite at the level of applying for a doctoral fellowship yet. So I guess, you know, my advice would be, you know, always look at the guidance. You know, never underestimate how important it is to read the guidance, and yeah, and that'll definitely help you get on the right path to PCAF. I mean, the PCAF is quite competitive, so again, don't underestimate the application. There's some very basic guidance I can give, but you know, fill out the sections. You know, if you have 250 words, for instance, to write about a supervisor, don't just write 100. Fill it up with, you know, fill all the sections, get as much information down as you can, and make it really specific as well. You know, we see a lot of applications that are quite general. In particular, the supporting statement can sometimes from the supporting organisations can sometimes be a bit general. You know, we want to see specifics in there. We want to see that you're supporting organisation, your host organisation. Don't just put down that they have seen so many people through a PhD. Put down numbers, put down names if you can, and also we don't want to see that, you know, how the number of people have just done a PhD. We want to know who's gone beyond that as well. That's really draws attention to how supportive an organisation is. You know, we want to know about people who've gone beyond PhD and gone into further higher levels.
Thank you. That's really informative. I've got a question here from Rusty about the NIHR Advanced Fellowships. Do they take on interdisciplinary projects? For example, mixing engineering with a clinical issue?
Tony's on mute, but I can.
The answer is absolutely yes, Rusty. What you have to be really careful of is that you make sure that your project, the thing that you're hanging around, looks like an appropriate training vehicle. So I'll give an example. At the clinical lecturer and senior clinical lecturer level, we have so many applications that are for feasibility trials. And people propose feasibility trials because they've been interested in an area in an intervention, for instance. They've come up with a modification to an existing intervention, or they've refined something, or they want to do that in the course of their fellowship, is refine an intervention. And then they know that by proposing a feasibility study, a feasibility trial, they can do RCT training, they can do some health economics, and they can piggyback a training program onto that, which sort of demonstrates their readiness to become an independent trialist and to do the full RCT afterwards. Now, as a panel, we get really bored with that because we have, I'd say, maybe half of our applications are that sort of model, but half our applications are that sort of model because it's really safe as a training vehicle. So when you propose something that's a bit more interdisciplinary, you just need to make sure that you're not putting yourself at a disadvantage against someone who's proposing something that's boring but safe. So yes, they will take them on, but you've got to create a narrative around it.
Yes, Anne-Maree, I think Anne-Maree wants to add on.
Yeah, just to say, so clearly Jane and I deal a lot with bioengineering people, and when I first started dealing with bioengineering people, it was a light bulb moment when I realised that a lot of bioengineering, that if you're looking at the stakeholder, it's surgeons. And that's not NIHR remit. The stakeholder, who the end, what we're trying to do is change patient care, so health and wealth of the nation. So absolutely, this fits in the NIHR advanced fellowships, but it has to be within remit. It has to be around the what the NIHR offer is. So that needs to be embedded in patient-public involvement and engagement. Is this an issue for patients? Are you solving an issue for patients, or are you just doing something that is interesting, because that won't get funded? And it's absolutely, so interdisciplinarity is key. They're wanting to promote people who are coming from different backgrounds, but it's really important to make sure that you speak the language. And that's the same with any funding organisation, that you really need to understand what the remit is. So I think that's incredibly important, but absolutely it would be a good thing to take on.
And one very quick last point on that, because I supervise a number of EPSRC funded PhD students, and the conversation I always have to have with them is that remember that your EPSRC funded PhD is an engineering PhD. You're not expected to answer a clinical question. You're expected to find the tools to enable someone else maybe to answer the clinical question. Whereas what you're proposing, Rosti, is to go that little bit further and to actually address a clinical problem. And you need to make sure you didn't do the opposite of what my engineering PhD students sometimes do, which is try and be too clinical when we want them to be engineers. And you'll need to be clinical enough even as an engineer.
Got another PCAF question here coming from Khalida, and I think we'll aim that for John, if that's okay. John, sure. If you succeed in applying for a PCAF, can you follow that with a PCAF bridge?
Simple answer, no.
Yeah.
They're both, the aim of both schemes are to prepare for a doctoral fellowship. So if you succeed in getting a PCAF, your next step is to apply for doctoral.
Yeah, I thought that was the answer, but
can I say, why would you want to? Because again, it's like that Tony was saying, it's just, that's not purpose built for you, and it's to me it's double dipping. And something that I would say to reinforce what John says is you must read the guidance notes. I think this type of conversation is really important because you get to find out some of the stuff that's behind the guidance notes. But it's kind of like, how dare you not? If you're applying for an advanced fellowship, you're looking at about 800 grand. If you're applying for a PCAF, you're looking at about, 80 grand. So how dare you not, just suck up, the information. And the guidance notes are absolutely there to help you, not to provide a barrier. And can I just ask, so Timothy Luxton has just asked about pathways for NIHR pathways for people without a clinical background. There are no pathways for people without a clinical background in terms of like a structured pathway for the medical and the allied health professionals, because that's around particularly the medical is around it being integrated as part of the training. But NIHR fellowships are absolutely open to people without a clinical background. And from memory, I think around about a third of the fellowships are actually given to people without a clinical background. So they're promoting things like health economists, statisticians, bioengineers, And again, it goes back to this whole idea about being in remit, that you just need to make sure that because this funding, I keep saying this funding is coming from the Department of Health and Social Care. So you're kind of taking this funding away from frontline services for the NHS. So it has to be important to the NHS. It has to be important to the health and the wealth of the nation. And that's where you need to make sure that you understand the remit. So, absolutely it's open there, but it needs to be in terms of health and wealth, making changes to patients. Because again, think of it, you're taking money away from kind of poor cardiac services in paediatrics.
I think that is it for the questions at the moment. Does anybody else have any other questions?
In that case, I'll just jump in and answer a bit of a conversation that's been going back and forth between Anna Taylor and Sarah and Maleka about if you've done a few different things in your early career, is that looked upon dimly? And I would say within NIHR, probably not as much as it would be looked upon dimly in sort of MRC, UKRI space, the more discovery science, where they expect you by and large to have followed a much more traditional pattern. I think in the clinical disciplines, having a look at a few different clinical areas and a few different sort of areas of interest that might interest you for following up in research, that's pretty much okay. And as Sarah wrote in the story, you just create a narrative around it. That I've worked in these various areas. I've got some publications. They are linked to a degree in the following way, and now I've really decided, and this is the direction I'm going to go.
We've actually just had another question from Joe, looking at a PCAF. I've got small project ideas within the same project area, but would one large project be preferable?
I mean, the PCAF isn't about doing research itself. So there's no funding in there for research. So they won't fund any consumables or anything. It's about training you to do a doctoral fellowship. So you to be able to apply for a doctoral fellowship. So I wouldn't. So you do put in there your research plans, your research background, but we're not particularly looking for that. We're more interested in the training package that you've put together and the supervisory package that you've put together. So by all means put them in, but it wouldn't make any difference.
Thank you. So it is 10 to 8, and oh no, that's a thanks from Joe. Thanks, that's really helpful. Does anybody else have any other questions or anything else that the panel would like to give out as free advice today? Rizwan has just asked a question. Are doctoral fellowships applicants expected to have many publications? I think we've spoken about that already.
The definition of many will vary by discipline. There would be an expectation that you probably have some, and in some disciplines a greater expectation. But the bottom line is they're going to be competitive schemes and you need to stand out a little bit. So if you're a bit underdone in the publications, and we've just talked about PCAFs, for instance, and ACFs, we'll quite often look at how we can get a PCAF or ACF candidate to do something with some existing data within the department or something to get a publication or two on their CV in the space that they're thinking about pursuing, just to shore that up a little bit. So I think lots of publications now, something in the space that you're proposing a doctoral fellowship in, I think, yes, would be expected.
And we just had a late question from Sarah. Can I ask the panel if they've any advice contemplating navigating the shark infested waters between the safe havens of fellowships?
Oh, Sarah, if you find the answer to that, can you let me know? Again, an observation: at pre-doctoral level, you're working out whether or not you want to commit to that type of career. Once you have a PhD under your belt, you probably would like to if you can, but for lots of people, it's still an option to step off and go and do something else. The higher up the tree you get, the more risky the more risky it feels. And I think the most vulnerable period in that whole progression, the most shark infested of the waters and the longest swim, is when you finished your PhD. and you don't hold much sway in your department. You can't get people to back you with a bit of soft money because you're not senior enough. And it seems like an awful long swim to the next island. Once you've got through the first advanced fellowship, for instance, you're probably well integrated in your department, and there are no guarantees, but you've probably committed fairly fundamentally to an academic career. Your department's probably wanting to support you a bit, so you've got a better chance of a lifeboat between those islands than you have at that immediate postdoc stage. But there's no easy answer. It's a period of horrible insecurity.
Can I also, I think sometimes you've just got to be a little bit realistic and a little bit pragmatic. My postdoc role was kind of more of an organiser and administrator for the BRC. And I was, that's not kind of what I wanted after my first postdoc, because it tended to be an administrative, more of an administrative role. But I had no choice because I didn't have any funding. But I was able to make kind of, an impact and kind of slightly change the role. So I think you need to, there needs to be a bit of, there's an impetus on you in how you make the most of the opportunities that you're given. And I think people going back from, say, an academic role into a clinical role, you often get dragged back into NHS, but there are some bridging schemes that are available to try and buy you out, if you're trying to do another fellowship. So there are some schemes available. Sometimes we have to go back into, if we're in academics, sometimes, we have to go back into teaching roles. And I would strongly suggest that you kind of look at it not being kind of an entitlement for you to kind of just continue to research, but to look at how you can make the most of your opportunities, because it's awful, it's rotten, it's really tricky, but it's kind of just realistic around what we're dealing with. Jennifer's asked something about a training package. We've just done a session on that, which Carol said will be on the website shortly. We can spend exactly the same amount of time talking about a training package for that. And Rena's asking about, is it still the case of the uni is it still the case that the university should be in a permanent contract? I can tell you, Rena, that the School of Medicine, for anyone who gets an advanced fellowship, gets a permanent contract. School of Healthcare will do exactly the same thing. So if you get an advanced fellowship, it's pretty much seen by the faculty that you're worth investing in. And of course, why wouldn't you? We would write that into that. And Rena, if you need any help formulating that letter, I'm more than happy to help with that, because that's what we do in the School of Medicine, that's what we do in the School of Healthcare.
And part of the trick to writing your application is to make the most of that. But as I mentioned in my slides, as a panel, we're also interested in what the School of Medicine or the School of Healthcare will do for you if you weren't successful. So you need to do a bit of, not padding, but you need to sort of prepare a bit of a safety net around that too. Because of course, if NIHR give you £800,000, the university is going to look favourably upon you. But how will they treat you if you haven't brought in 800,000?
And it's kind of a really empty promise, I reckon, in terms of the school. It's like, of course they'll fund you if you're bringing in an advanced fellowship. But if you don't, oh well.
There was a question about COVID as well, which I would like to touch on, because having just completed a round, one of the things we did in the application process, up to a point, we looked for it, but these were applications that were submitted in May, June last year, and we were doing the final sort on these in January this year. We looked to see whether there were plans within their application that might be sort of COVID safe, if you like. But at interview, we specifically gave candidates an extra minute to talk about the implications of COVID to their proposed body of work, and then we had questions ready that if they if we did consider them to be at risk of being able to deliver on what they were proposing because of COVID, that we would ask them specific questions on the sort of COVID mitigation. So that's slightly different to the question you asked, Malenka, but COVID is absolutely front and centre in people's minds at the moment. So yes, be honest, and be honest in what you're proposing in terms of the sort of COVID risk mitigation. You know, be prepared to be, you know, we have to, as a panel, have to be prepared to be flexible, that some of what you're proposing this year in 2021 in lockdown 3 might have to change in 2022 depending on how things go. So you can talk about that in your application, both how it's impacted your career trajectory to date. Don't overdo it. You're not, you know, not going for the violin story, but it's legitimate to mention it. But absolutely how you would incorporate COVID planning into your future. If it's affected you in your past, then what have you learned from it, and how have you incorporated that into your planning for the future?
And with that, we have 3 minutes to go, so I'm going to close today's meeting. So I'd like to thank Professor Keenan, Professor Redmond and Dr. John Gierula for their time this evening. It's been an enlightening panel discussion. Thank you so much.